Good morning and welcome to Illinois Soy Advisors webinar, Conservation and Farmland Leasing, Issues for Non-Operating Landowners. This webinar is brought to you by the Illinois Corn Marketing Board and the Illinois Soybean Checkoff, funded by the Nature Conservancy. I'm Megan Baskerville, Illinois Ag Program Director at the Nature Conservancy, and I'll be your moderator for today. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning. And of course, I have a few housekeeping items to begin with. First, please answer this poll question that was just launched to help us know who is in attendance this morning. This poll will help our presenter tailor his discussion as well. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will automatically be submitted for one CEU in professional development at the conclusion of the webinar. If you're listening to a recording of the webinar later on, you will need to go to the Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and self-report for credit. You can ask questions during the webinar today by using the GoToWebinar dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I'm happy to be moderating today's discussion. Again, I'm Megan Baskerville with the Nature Conservancy. Oh, great, there's the poll results. We've got lots of producers, landowners, and others, and lots of CCAs. That's great. But again, yes, I'm Megan Baskerville with the Nature Conservancy. If you're not familiar with us, TNC is a global conservation organization dedicated to conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. Guided by science, we currently work in 79 countries and territories using a collaborative approach that engages local communities, governments, the private sector, and other partners. For our agriculture work in Illinois, we're proud to be one of the founding members of the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, where we deliver resources, innovative trainings, and peer networks to support a systems approach to improve soil health and reduce nutrient loss in Illinois. We realize that with over half of the row crop acres in Illinois not being operated by the owner, the tools that Gary will be discussing today are critical to increase the environmental outcomes on these lands. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Gary Schnitkey. Gary is a professor and farm management specialist in the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he regularly contributes content to FarmDoc Daily, where he focuses on farm and risk management by examining issues impacting the profitability of grain farms. Schnitkey grew up on a grain and hog farm in Northwest Ohio and received his bachelor's degree from The Ohio State University and a master's degree and PhD from UIUC. So with that, Gary, I will hand it over to you.
Good morning and welcome to this webinar, and we're going to be talking today about conservation and farmland leasing and obviously issues with non-operating landowners. So that's our topic for today, and I'm going to divide this this presentation up into two parts. The first part is just an overview of farmland leasing in Illinois, just provide some basic background here, and then do some conservation addendums. And here's the link between those two topics. We have developed 3 conservation addendums, which is a way for farmers and landowners to talk and agree to one another. They're formal leasing addendums, so they're in addition to the basic leasing agreement. They don't really work. You can't, I suppose you could do the conservation addendum without a basic farm lease, but really they are designed to be part of the farm leasing process. So you have to have the basic lease, and then you add these addendums to those. And there are 3 addendums to our conservation addendums that are part of those leases, and those deal with soil health, nutrient management, and habitat set aside. So those are what those 3 addendums do. And again, we'll come back to those in a bit. All of those addendums and our basic lease agreements, which you see here, are available on the FarmDoc website. They are in 2 places actually, but in either the agricultural law section or in the management section, and I'll show you a web address for getting those later. But there are different lease agreements on that site depending on what you want to do or the type of leasing agreement that you want to have. And again, the conservation addendums are in addition to these basic lease agreements. In Illinois, there is a great deal of farmland that is rented. This slide shows the percent of farmland rented or leased. This happens to come from 2020. You'll notice that that Illinois and well down the Mississippi River as well as parts of Iowa, there's a high percent of the farmland leased. Over 60% in those counties that you see in the darkest blue. In Illinois, that tends to be in the central part of the state and also in the northern part of the state. So we have a large amount of leased land in Illinois. And if you look at the entire nation, roughly 40% of the farmland that is farmed is leased from a non-operating landowner. So it is a big deal, and over 40% in the United States. And then if you narrow that down to Illinois, it's almost or over 50% of the farmland is rented. And again, that varies in Illinois depending on where you're at. It's going to be higher in northern and central Illinois and lower in western sort of and southern Illinois. For a number of reasons, Illinois has the largest percent of rented farmland. If you look at states around us, Indiana has 45%, Iowa has 41%, Ohio has 37%, just to give you a feel for the range there. But Illinois has the largest amount of farmland rented of any state in the United States. The other thing about rented land is that when you get to larger farm sizes, particularly grain farms, much more of the land is rented. And you see that over on the box on the right-hand side of this screen, which shows statistics from FBFM for northern, central, and southern Illinois. You can see there that it does vary by the area in the state, but on those farms, and the average farm size of these farms would be about 15 to 1,700 acres. 19% in northern Illinois, central Illinois has 14%. We have a bit higher percent in southern, 22% is owned, which means that the rest is rented. So as we get to larger farm sizes, we see more of the land rented. And again, if you're looking at a typical farm in Illinois and you're looking at a 1,000 acre farm and over, essentially, usually if you see that farm, about 20% or less is owned and the rest is rented. So that rented farmland is key on those operations that are larger, that tend to be commercially sized. Those percentages stay pretty constant once you reach 1,500 acres. So a 5,000 acre farm, a 10,000 acre farm, etc., will have roughly these same percentages that we're showing here. Although I can find some larger farms and smaller farms as well that have near 0% of their farmland owned and most of it rented. So if those as we increase the farm size, percent of farmland that is rented increases. Leasing basics. Written leases are the best. We have models on FarmDoc. You can get models elsewhere. If you're with a farm manager, there will be many leases that or farm managers will have their own leasing forms. Again, we have model leases on FarmDoc that can be used. Written lease is the best, although we still have quite a few leases that are not written. And if we don't have a written lease and the landowner wants to terminate that lease, they must provide notification by October 31st. If we have a written lease, the specifications in that written lease will supersede those in the October 31st deadline. That is an important detail, particularly when we get to those leases that are being terminated. Most of the leases that we see in Illinois are one-year leases or year-to-year leases. There is not a long-term commitment embedded in the lease. A lot of these leases go on from year to year to year, but there is no contractual commitment to continue that lease beyond the next year. Again, most of these leases are year to year to year. And the University of Illinois leases are designed this way as well. If you just simply agree to continue the lease, you agree to continue and nothing changes. If you want to make changes in the specification, then they have to be made and done year by year. But the lease itself is only a year lease. You will see some longer term leases, but they are generally only 2 to 3 year leases. You don't see much longer than that. And in fact, if you have a cash rent lease, I would discourage anything longer than 2 or 3 years because you don't know what the cash rent should be. Going forward, it's difficult to say 2 to even next year what the cash rent should be, let alone 3 years from now. So particularly if we're doing a cash rent lease, we would not even encourage leases beyond year to year because it's so difficult to say what the cash rent should be. I mean, we could have events in agriculture that changes what that level should be. In Illinois, and it says elsewhere, there are different types of leases. We have share rents and cash rents, which are the two predominant types. And if you're looking at what we're seeing over time, we're seeing a movement away from share rent leases to cash rent leases. Besides being higher in rented land, Illinois also happens to be higher in share rented land, but over time we've been seeing the movement away from share rent to cash rent. Cash rent largely is a simpler lease to implement. If we're looking at share rents, we generally have to share, as the name implies, revenue, crop revenue, and government payments, and direct cost, seed, fertilizer, pesticides, drying, storage, and crop insurance. And in Northern Illinois, that's typically a 50-50 share. And in Southern Illinois, we tend to see different type leases with often the farmer getting a higher percent. Again, cash rent is where we're seeing a lot of movement to. Cash rent leases would be the farmer pays a fixed cash rent to the landowner and then receives all of the revenue from the acre and pays all the expenses. The landowner typically still pays the land cost, which would include property tax. We've also began to see a bit of a movement to variable cash rent leases, which varies the crop revenue. Frankly, most of those variable cash rent leases are used by professional farm managers, and then custom farming is an option as well. In Illinois, we see most of the leases between share and cash rent. Share rent agreements, again, in Illinois, in Northern and Central Illinois, is typically a 50-50 share. 50% of the revenue, 50% of the expenses go to the landowner, and the other 50% go to the farmer. So it's a 50-50 share. Sometimes you see a supplemental rent as part of those agreements. This would be typically in the range of $20 to $30, and that's paid by the farmer to the landowner. And the farmer typically bears all the labor and machinery expenses associated with farming that land. So they would pay the labor and provide the machinery. You can see here that share rent agreement arrangements vary across the state. 21% Northern Illinois is the percentage here. And if you get to Central Illinois, we see more share rent arrangements than we do in Northern Illinois and now in Southern Illinois. Again, this percentage has been going down over time. Share rents have been moving about 1% per year from share rent to cash rent leases. Cash rent leases, what we see typically, have seen typically, here's average cash rents in Illinois. They went up considerably during our good times, reached a peak in 2014, and have came down a bit, and then have been fairly stable since 2017, $218 in 2017, and $223 in 2018, and $224 in both 2019 and 2020. Essentially, we're seeing stable cash rents in Illinois. One of the issues with a cash rental arrangement is that setting that cash rent every year and determining what that the cash rent should be, and we'll again have difficulties setting that cash rent this year. Again, cash rents, as you would expect, vary across the state, tend to be higher in Central Illinois. This map shows the average cash rent by county in Illinois, and this happens to be 2019 data. We will get the 2020 data here in a week or so. Not this Friday, but the Friday afterwards. You can see here in Central Illinois is where the higher cash rents tend to be. And for example, the highest cash rent was, I believe it was Macon County, $296. Piatt County $295, Sangamon County $290. So that gives you a feel, and then we get lower cash rents. This has been the average cash rent, and then Southern Illinois has lower cash rents. The averages haven't moved much. If you're looking at those rents and wondering, and you have a piece of land in those counties and wondering, well, I'm getting less than that. Well, yeah, you could. That could be a realistic scenario, because those rents depend on land productivity. There is considerable range in rents in a county. A lot of that has to do with productivity, and a lot of that has to do with just the relationship between farmers and landowners. These rents show rents 2019 and expected 2020 for 4 different types of land. This is from professionally managed land in Illinois. Excellent farmland would have an expected yield over 200 bushels per acre. Good, somewhere between 190 and 200. Average something like 175 to 190, and then fair below that. You can see what those rents are. Again, this is where we're currently at. From professionally managed land, that would be higher than the average cash rent, and it just points to the diversity that exists out there in cash rents. We also have encouraged people to think about a variable cash rent, and this just shows the parameters of it. One of the difficulties that we see with cash rents is setting that cash rent every year. This year, going into next year, one of the difficulties is anticipating what federal aid will be in 2021. That has been really significant in our returns in 2018, 2019, and likely 2020. To give you a feel, that's been $50 to $100 per acre in those years, depending on where you're at in the state, and that will have a big impact on what those payments would look like. We sort of suggest thinking about a variable cash rent. This would be for Central Illinois. Think about setting that at $200 per acre, and then looking at pay a higher cash rent if crop revenue plus government payments exceed that base cash rent, and sort of thinking that 33% to 40% range of factors for corn and soybeans. So seeing more interest in these type leases, and this will give you a feel for what those lease terms look like for this variable cash rent. Again, Those lease terms are available. Our leasing terms are available in our FarmDoc website. Go to the agricultural law section and you'll see a fillable PDF there, and that will aid in the discussion between the landowner and the tenant. So those are there. These are what those leases look like. You can see there the bluish line. There's a fillable PDF version of those, as well as a version, a Word version. So just go to our website, FarmDoc, and you can download those there. And those are the basic lease forms. So now we got our basic lease form done. Now we can use those. We're signing our basic lease form. Now we're going to move into conservation addendums to those leases. So we have basic lease form. Now we want to think about the landowner and the farmer agreeing to some sort of conservation addendum that goes along with that. Again, this is an option for leasing, and what's driving this is more and continuing conservation, soil health, nutrient management concerns from Illinois farmland. Just to give some issues for that, what's driving that, one of the bigger things that is driving that is nutrient loss from Illinois and Midwest farmland, nitrogen in particular from Illinois, entering water bodies, making their way down the Mississippi River and causing difficulties with cough hypoxia. There's also concerns about sustainability of production, soil loss, drainage, and the whole 9 yards. Those conservation concerns obviously have always existed in agriculture, but we suspect they're being heightened now with the nutrient management and just the general shift in societal concerns and being more concerns about how our farms produce the food. And you can see that concerns with consumers, the growth in organic sustainability production, and that interest has increased over time and will likely increase in the future. Obviously, a lot of that is also political, and who wins elections matters a great deal on what those things look like. So as we see elections change, the emphasis on these conservation practices will likely change as well. We have compliance issues already. Most of us have dealt with those pretty easily. The 1985 Farm Bill created highly erodible land, HEL plans. You have to have an HEL plan in place to get farm program payments, and that compliance has also been included in crop insurance. So right now, we already have those conservation compliance concerns built into farm bills and eligibility, and also crop insurance eligibility, both highly erodible land as well as wetland concerns. So, and again, as you look forward, you can expect more of those, not less of those, and you can look at some of the political discussion that's happening out there and more closely tying what's happening on farmland to farmland program payments and crop insurance. You can reasonably anticipate in the future that crop insurance eligibility and premium support will be tied more to practices on the farmland. We're also seeing a growing ecosystem services market. This happens to be one of them. You can see where payments could be made to farmers in Illinois and elsewhere for various soil health building measures related to tillage, related to cover crops, related to a number of items. but those markets are being attempted to be developed now, and you can see those continuing to be developed into the future. Some of those you can see where the payments will be associated with, for example, building organic matter or whatever carbon or whatever the measure happens to be for measuring soil health or organic matter, and being paid on that in the future. Here's the issue, and let me just give you an issue with these conservation measures, and let me give you an example with cover crops. We have an issue on leased land, and let's just talk about that with regard to cover crops. We know that if you practice cover crops that there are environmental benefits. And in particular, if we have an overwintering cover crop, what we do know is that you will reduce nitrogen in drainage tiles. Lowell Gentry's work and Shalimar Armstrong's work shows that anytime we have cover crop overwintering, we do reduce nitrogen in drainage tiles, and it's probably, it's undoubtedly one of the most, it's one of the ways that you can reduce nitrogen effluent from a field that you can think of. There's also good reason to believe that a buildup of organic matter, particularly over time, will have potential yield advantages in the future. The other thing about cover crops, so if we continually plant cover crops, models would suggest that we will build organic matter, which will increase their yield potential. Where you would likely see those yields being built are in the adverse years. If you want to think about it, organic matter, soil carbon serves as a reservoir. It would help in a year like 2012, the drought years. Those are the years in which we notice the biggest changes in yield based on what has been cropping practices. For example, in 2012, we saw much larger yield losses on corn after corn farmland than corn after soybeans. The other thing that we know about cover crops is that farmers need to build experience in the use of the cover crops to make it successful. It's a different process than just not using cover crops. And then with any practice, we have to build confidence, management expertise. If you're looking at cover crops, the payoffs here are often long run or not accruing to farmland, to the farm. The environmental benefit isn't necessarily accruing to the farm. There isn't a increase in return immediately if we reduce nitrogen. If we build organic matter over time, it's a long run sort of experience. Leasing contracts are short run. So you have a practice that will have long run implications, but our contracts are short term in nature. And this is something that we're going to have to deal with in the future. And these leasing addendums that I'm going to show you right now begin to address those issues. So long run, short run, the leasing addendums move in that direction. Those leasing addendums are on our website, and again, we have 3 of them. We have a conservation habitat addendum, a nutrient management addendum, and a soil health and conservation addendum. Those are available for download. You click get the form, you download it, it's a fillable PDF. You could combine that, and it's meant to be combined with, for example, a crop share lease form, the fixed cash rent, the short form, or longer form. The longer form includes variable cash rents in it. The fixed cash rent is just a straight cash rental arrangement. You can download those, and then the farmer and landowner can look those over and agree to the practices that are going that we would like to see happen on that farm. Again, this is something where if we want these practices to occur, landowner wants them to occur, or the farmer wants to do those, we have to have some discussion about whether those practices occur and what those might look like. So that's what these conservation addendums are designed to do. Again, these addendums are a portion or added to the normal lease. We're going to go through each one of these, and the first one that I'm going to mention is the nutrient management addendum. And this one, and again, we're looking at 3 here. This is the nutrient management addendum. I'm going to go through each one. Nutrient management addendum addresses issues on how farmers and tenants apply fertilizer on leased land. And it does a number of things, but a lot of it is built around the maximum return to nitrogen. That's developed with university-based recommendations. Emerson Nafziger has been very involved in the MRTN. So part of that MRTN is built into these leases. We also include phosphorus and potassium concerns in those leases as well. So let me give you an example of the lease, what the MRTN looks like. So you'll download it. This is what you'll see at the beginning. You're going to fill in these parts here, and then there are going to be some various recitals, which Jonathan Compass, our lawyer, put together. But here's what part of that looks like. And now we're going to talk about specific nutrient management practices. Again, this is a screenshot of the lease itself, and these deal with specific nutrient management practices. What a person would do is, if they want this one, they would check mark the box and then enter a percentage here. So check mark the box, enter a percentage here, and then after signing this agreement, the farmer and the landowner agree that that will be the nitrogen application on the farm. Again, all of these are designed to be check marks. So we're trying to make this easy here, but this one, check mark this. This is, you'll apply rates at MRTN. We can say at least 50% of the nitrogen fertilizer will be applied after planting. Is another option here. Adopt split nitrogen applications, so you could enter the percentage there, and then include amount of nitrogen applied in DAP and MAP as part of the nitrogen management plan. If you're using this lease addendum, what you would do is check mark those that you want to have applied. So if you, and you could check mark 1, 2, you would likely, you could check 3. My guess is that you wouldn't check 2 or 3 here, but you would check mark those that would apply to this individual situation and leave the rest blank. There are others here. Oops, excuse me. There's so calculate credits from manure, do soil testing, adopt a nutrient management plan in coordination with approval of NRCS. Manure and nitrogen fertilizer not on frozen ground, and then leaser owner is not liable for any nutrient management practices. So you can check mark those as you see fit. This again is based on MRTN, applications at MRTN, and again we're thinking that it has the highest economic returns, so moving to those MRTN levels likely has the highest economic return. These happen to be the MRTN rates for 2019, 2020 rates vary a bit from these, but this was happened to take in a 370 corn price, 615 anhydrous ammonia price. But you can see here, so for Central Illinois, corn following soybeans, the rate that they would be suggesting was 174 pounds and then 163 pounds if 28%. The reason why it's less is because nitrogen solution cost more. That's what drives those being less. But you can see those. You would go to this MRTN site to get those rates, and you would click on this, select Northern, Central, and Southern Illinois, and enter your prices in, and then MRTN rates would result from that. Here, just to give you a feel, here is we've been looking at nitrogen application rates on PCM farms, precision conservation management farms. This shows nitrogen application in pounds and yields from 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. You can see here what those yields look like with higher nitrogen rates. There's a pretty straight line in most years, and obviously as you increase the nitrogen application rate on these operations, these fields, cost associated with nitrogen application go up because you're putting more nitrogen on, and you have to cover that with yield. And here's what we find over time, that if we're looking at land returns from farms that have between 151 to 175 and 176 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, those two are the ones where we see the highest return. So that's the justification for a lot of the reason for putting those MRTNs in this soil nutrient endorsement. Soil health addendum, and again, so we have the MRTN nutrient management addendum. We also have soil health addendum, and this would cover practices such as reduced and conservation tillage, cover cropping, and again, if you look at the addendum, download the addendum, what you will see, again, is the addendum. You're going to see basically the same sort of form. This is soil health and conservation addendum. You will fill in the leasing forms as we've done before, and then you will see a bunch of check marks that you can check, and they will be divided out into general areas. General soil health, tillage, cover crops, and then there's other related to maintaining waterways, maintaining terraces, maintaining vegetative buffers, maintaining bioreactors, and maintaining conservation structures. So you can see what's involved here with this lease form and what's all included in that. I'm going to show you some of these, the soil health and conservation. Excuse me, I hit the button too fast. So you can see here some of the things that would be included generally. You could check mark those. And following NRCS recommendations to implementing water conservation and soil erosion practices concerns. There are specific soil health practices that can be adopted. Adopt practices such that X% crop residual remains on the farmland. Adopt, and these, adopt a one tillage pass system, adopt a no tillage practice system. You wouldn't type this one and do this one as well. You would select one or the other. There will be no fall tillage after harvesting soybeans. An attempt in good faith to establish and manage cover crops on those farms. There are others. There's a specific section for cover crop practices. One of these terms, we will say cover crops survive the winter, that is not survive the winter. There's some that deal with funding and who receives that funding and who is then responsible for all cost above that funding. One thing that I would mention, if the landowner wants cover crops on the farm, it's probably not, or it isn't consistent to have a very high cash rent and have cover crops, particularly if it's the first time that we're doing cover crops on that operation. Again, cover crops have benefits in the future. They have benefits for the environment that don't necessarily immediately accrue to the farmer, so that if we're expecting cover crops on those operations, we should probably be reducing the cash rent somewhat to cover those cover crop expenses associated with that. Again, if you're looking at that, and again, if you're looking at a particular piece of farmland, some rents on some farmlands are well above average, and thinking that we're going to put cover crops on that situation is different than thinking about putting cover crops on the landowner farmer relationship where that cash rent is below average. And again, particularly in the environment that we're in today, additional cost without an immediate return is going to be difficult to justify on the farming side. Conservation habit addendum. If we're concerned about habitat, this one deals with conservation habitat, and this addendum deals with establishment, maintenance, and integration of management. And in general, you're going to have adjustment to rent to address the repairs and replacement issues associated with habitat, these habitat management practices. Again, like the other leases, you'll see the same thing. You'll download it, and then you can go through some of the provisions. There's some optional. One of those is maintaining roads so that during the nesting season, there's habitat there. Pollinator habitats is included, as well as integrated pest management practices. So you can see some of those that are there. There's a list of these. If we do those, one of the things that we will, particularly if we're adding a habitat that's taking away from farmland, we're going to have to adjust the farmland rent down to account for the fact that we're taking farmland out of production, and we'll have to adjust cash rents down because that land is no longer in production. And again, it depends on where the practice is occurring. If we're looking at ditches, etc., that may be different than taking land out of production. So those are some of the conservation addendums that we have available. Later today, is Alphabet Soup. This will happen at 12 a.m. today. Alphabet Soup is something that Illinois Soybean Association does from time to time. It's going to happen today. There's still time for that. We will have people there from AFT, Ashley Bricker, Precision Conservation Management. We showed some of the details from that. That's Clay Best will be there, and we'll have a farmer and landowner, Joe Rothmeyer, and I spelled that name wrong. I apologize. It's Joe, and John Enflell, a landowner. To get there, you go to this tinyurl.com soup0820, and this is the screen you will see. I would encourage you to take part in that if you want to learn more and learn from people that have done it themselves. And all these individuals have experience with these items. I appreciate your time today. Thank you for being on Zoom. When I looked at the list, I saw a number of names I recognize. I'm sorry we're not meeting. It would be nice to see all your faces again, but maybe we'll be doing that soon. So I throw it back to Megan.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. As always, good content. Folks out there in the audience, feel free to keep entering questions into that chat function. We will answer them as they come up. But I guess I've got one question for you, Gary. Looking through those addendums when you went through them, what stuck in my mind is wondering about verification. So do the lease addendums have a process for the landowner and tenant to verify whatever was agreed upon happened?
So that item is not specifically addressed in that lease. You could add verbiage that say, so for example, typically, and some of these would be pretty easy to verify, and some of them would be harder to verify. But let me give you an example. On a typical lease, I would encourage the landowner to get the yields from that land because from government program standpoint, we need to follow those yields over time. That we just specify that for nutrient management, if we want to make sure that our nitrogen is applied at less than MRTN, we have a field map or invoice. Again, the problem with verification is good. We have to have verification of these things, and that's good. I would also say that in the end, you got to also have some trust between the landowner and the farmer, and you can't verify everything. So. I might. Hey, Megan, I can't hear you.
Thank you, Gary. I was going to say that's a good follow-up to this next question, because I do agree that there's trust, and a lot of these practices might be new for one or the other party. So you mentioned a little bit about timeline. What, just from your personal experience, if someone's going to be adding something new or wanting to have these conversations about a new lease or addendum, what would be a good time to bring these things up well before the October 31st?
No, the time to talk about these leasing agreements is or these practices. We need lead time to make those happen. So if a landowner or wants those, I would encourage starting that conversation now. It's not likely that these things are going to happen. Well, we're going to whip out this agreement and we're going to agree to it. It's going to take several conversations to agree about what's going to happen on that farming operation, and springing it in April doesn't work. So talking about it now and sort of because farmers are already making plans for next year. We're going to be buying seed here soon. And I think just generally thinking through the process, having a tentative agreement, and now I'm talking optimal, September, October, November, sort of that time, and finalizing it in January, February would be a way of thinking that through. These decisions are long-term, and again, if the landowner wants those to happen, thinking through those and working together and beginning that process now is probably the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience: what tools exist to support adjusting the lease amount based on these practices?
So
yeah.
So that's a good question. That's always murky because it does depend on where you're starting the cash rent. So let me give you an example. All right, in Central Illinois, the average cash rent, on high productivity farmland, the average cash rent is $275. If you're at 300, we're going to have to make a bigger adjustment than we're at 275 than we're at 250. So the starting point really matters. Then you would back up and say, if I do a cover crop, it's going to cost me $25 to $30 to do it. Let's think about adjusting our lease by somewhere in that range of that amount.
That seems simple enough.
That seems, but by the way, that seems simple enough when you try and, I know that's hard to do when you try and implement something like that. So.
Right. And then I guess just one final question, since you mentioned it, but this look ahead to the future of possible ecosystem service payments. if you had a crystal ball or if you had advice on how that should go, or if that's just another lease addendum and a conversation.
I cut off my mic there. Could you repeat your last question? So.
Oh, sure. Just with the, you mentioned the ecosystem services, the payments that might be coming up in the future as companies and others want to pay for those carbon credits or water quality credits. Do you have any advice for how that should be decided?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I was king for the day, which I'm not, no one's making me a king for the day. I would base most of those payments on either residual that you can observe at a certain point in time, or whether there's a cover crop there at a certain point in time. The reason why I say that, and I know that we're going to try and measure carbon, organic matter in the soil, but right now those are pretty difficult to measure consistently. Whereas I think we're closer on this other part, and that's my bias. But I would base it on something like that, something that's more observable, something that's more verifiable consistently. I suspect over time that we will get better at testing, and we'll move in that direction.
Sure. One more question did come in, so that was not the final. But they say that the longer a lease, the more benefits a farmer would get from these conservation measures, which is what we all want to see. Is there a good mechanism for setting fair cash rent levels year by year in a long-term lease?
Yeah, so this is the hard part. All right, so I would, if I were doing that, I would suggest doing a variable cash lease. And again, let me just tell you right now, if you asked me what a long-term lease rate or rate should have been in 2015, it would have varied more from what I would say in 2020. And I don't know if we can anticipate that. I would do it by a variable cash rental arrangement, have a base cash rent, and have something like 30, 33, 34% of the corn revenue and 40, 41, 42% of the soybean revenue constituting the payment. Those, there will be issues. I mean, anytime you do something long-term in agriculture, there will be issues, but that appears to me to be the better way of going about a long-term agreement than guessing what the cash rent should be for the next 10 years. I don't know what it should be. Hopefully higher than it is today, but we'll see in the future.
Sure. Well, I think that wraps up the questions then, Gary, that we have. Again, thank you for this. And the webinar will be recorded for others too to access in the future. But this will wrap up the webinar on conservation and farmland leasing. I think we'll have a post-event survey, so please take a few minutes after the webinar to answer that survey. And then, yes, you can review the recording of this presentation on the checkoff-funded website, ilsoyadvisor.com. So again, thank you, Gary, and thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.